Hello. Uh, I wanted to make a video covering over some of the things that I had to do in order to export from Blender into Unreal using the Alembic format when I wanted to render it in Unreal, because I actually ended up running into a few problems that some tutorials both helped me with and didn't. So I wanted to cover some things. Here is an animation that I made in Blender, and for me, Alembic is already supported as an export option, so you can go to File, Export Alembic. For me, to make sure that everything was as compatible as I wanted, I normally delete the camera and the light, since I did the camera work and the lighting in Unreal. But one of the important things you have to note is there's a few things that you have to make sure are correct before you export, which is Unreal normally expects 30 frames a second animation. I made my animation at 24 frames a second, so I have to make sure I've got everything selected in my scene or unchecked this so it shows the data for everything. I highlight all of it, and you can actually then, as long as your marker is at the first frame, you can then hit S to scale and scale it by 1.25, which I'm just typing it in after pressing S and then left clicking to enter, and it scales it by 1.25, which 24 times 1.25 is 30. So I was effectively taken it and made it 30 frames a second, which I can then go to that, and then I can hit playback, set in frame, and that way it is now the new frame rate that it is trying to export at, which is important that I also then go to output and set the frame rate to 30. If you don't do this, when you import it into Unreal, you can try to edit the frame range to make it work correctly, but this guarantees that the default frame rate that Unreal expects is the frame rate it's getting. Otherwise, you will run into some errors when it goes and plays. It will also not be the frame range that you expect. So then you can go to export Alembic, and some things are going to be blacked out on my screen depending on what's being shown. Also, apologies if you hear any sound. Unreal, it kind of makes the fans on the computer whir. But when you go to export it, one of the things that you have to make sure is that you also set the scale to 100. The reason for this is Blender's base unit is meters, base unit in Unreal is centimeters. So you have to make sure that it's scaled up by 100, so it's not going to be awkwardly tiny. If you don't do this, you could scale it up afterwards, but you might also run into errors where it starts making your model blocky due to the smallest unit available in Unreal not being good enough for what you've got. So then you check your frame range, make sure it's correct. These other settings I mostly leave as is, except I normally check face sets. This is important for if you want to be able to import and export things related to materials, as I'll show when I go to import it later. And then you also got to make sure to check triangulate. If you're using anything that doesn't have triangles and you try to import it, Unreal will say that it won't accept it because it's not triangles or quads, which some things in my scene, if it's like a cylinder in Blender, not by default uses it, or the cylinders in Blender have ingons by default on the tops and bottoms, so it won't work. I keep the settings for this normal. I don't have any particle systems, but if you did, you could mess with these. I'm unchecking them. Then you just give it a name and export. I've already done it and labeled mine. The number at the end is just because I've had to test this good a few times. And then you just hit this, export. It'll take it a little bit, and it'll finish. Then what you do is you can open up Unreal. I can actually show the import here because I'll just go ahead and uncheck that. One of the things that I normally make a folder for the purpose of doing it. So here I can actually go ahead and make a new folder to show this off. But once you got Unreal, which for me, I opened it up and actually made a blank film scene under one of the settings. Let me see if I can actually show how to do that real quick. That would actually take a while. Let me try it anyway. I'm going to close it if it forces me to. But the idea is I made a blank film scene because that's one of the easiest ways to get the default settings that you want. Otherwise, it'll be harder to try to take a game scene and do it. So here I went to film, video, and events, and I made a blank one. You can also, if you want to make it easier on yourself, if you wanted to have more ray tracing capability, double or check this box before you hit create. I'm going to hit cancel there because I've already got my scene open. I clicked the content browser to bring this up. I made a folder, and here is where I'm going to click to import the Alembic file. And then in here, you're probably not going to be able to see too much of this since I'm going to have to block out a good chunk of it, but I'm just selecting my scene file from earlier. And then here is where you get all the import settings. So on this, static mesh is one of the options that you can choose if you don't plan on anything moving. Mine has both, because I'm exporting the whole scene at once rather than exporting the background and all that as static. You could do that, and then import my characters, which do have armatures, as skeletons, but I'm trying to do the whole thing at once. So here I'm actually going to be using geometry cache because that's what I've been messing around with. Now in Blender, Unreal wants to start at 0. My Blender one starts at 1. I don't know how big of a difference it actually makes having that one frame off, but I do that just in case. Flattened tracks doesn't make too much of a difference for me because the vertex animations don't end up needing to be separated, but if you needed that for some reason, that's why you'd uncheck that. I normally, just in case, actually click this and press 0 to do that and set this number to 16. These are just increasing the accuracy of the vertex placements and the animations. It helps a little bit for me, but the defaults are probably just fine. Then the main thing is that I go to, I haven't had to mess with normals, mine have been fine, is depending on it, you might want to tell it to create materials. What this would do is it would create for all the times that you try to export Alembic files, because you can't necessarily use the materials from Blender. What this will do is this will make a material corresponding to each of the materials that you had, at least a name, and it automatically assign them to the objects that had them. Whereas find materials is what you check if you already had materials with their names in here, as with my other folder has. Might be able to, no, it's not going to let me click off of it. But so if you want it to make them, you hit this and it will auto assign them. If you don't, they'll all be given the generic default material, and you'll have to manually assign them, which, because my characters are made up of a bunch of individual objects, would take way too long. So create is what you want there. If they already exist, you hit fine. I'm going to try hitting create here because I can show that off, and I'm in a new folder, so hopefully it'll show that there. Though it might not actually work since they've already got them, but we'll see, because I've already got them in another folder. In here, because I've already scaled it up in Blender, I don't have to edit the scale here. The settings should work as you would want. Technically, your object's going to be rotated funny. If you wanted it to be facing forward, I think you would do 90 here and then 270 here, but you could always just rotate it afterwards. The scaling should be done in Blender, though, just in case for issues of base units. And then you can hit import. The hitting settings I don't think matter here. Yeah. And this will take a little bit. It will look a lot slower than it implies because it doesn't actually have to go to the full length in order to import it, because that, for me, at like 10%, it just jumps to completion. Yeah. And see here, it's gone ahead and made a bunch of materials that the scene is now going to use. However, they're all going to be blank. This is because it can't really read anything from it. I think if you're using something like Maya, supposedly you could somehow get the materials to be usable. I think outside of using the USD format, the Alembic file I don't think is good for pulling materials from Blender into Unreal. But you can then edit the materials. I'm just going to set my thing back up at the location I want it to. I clicked and dragged it into the scene. I think it's just facing the wrong way at this point, which I can then use the rotator to rotate. Mostly just trying to figure out where my camera is, because I've already pre-placed my camera. I've lost it. I don't know how I lost it, but regardless, wherever your camera is, this is closer to where it's supposed to be, actually. I can just disable this, see where it is. Yeah. Oh, the reason I can't see my camera is because my sequence isn't active. That's right. So for me, I have my scene normally facing this way, so I would just have this one be there. And to edit the materials, if you wanted to do that or needed to, which again, if you already have them, you can check the find one instead. For me, I can't do a full tutorial on how to do something like materials here, but just as a quick show, because I had to figure it out, is it's actually under constants 3 vector, and you can double click this to get a color, and that would allow you to do something like that. Hit save, it goes through, compiles it, and now everything that's assigned to it gets that color. And you'll notice if I click on this and scroll down to the materials, you'll see why it's important to use that create, because for me, I have a bunch of different elements here that are listed. Now it doesn't look like so much here, but I think if it's not really showing it, but the characters are made of a bunch of individual objects, so these materials normally get separated up to like 60. Here, for some reason, it did a lot better of a job and only shows the 9 for the different ones, which, if that's the same way for you, that can make it easier if you needed to place them manually. But once you have this set up, normally you want to be able to take this and then put it into a sequence. So normally what you then have to do is create a sequence, which you, I think, can force into existence if you can pull up the sequencer menu. Maybe not. Actually, normally you have to do something there, so I think... how did I make the sequence before? I might jump here if I can't make something quickly. Cinematics, here we go. Level sequence. And then once you have a level sequence, what you can do is you can open that up by double clicking it. It brings it into the sequencer, which here, for geometry cache like things, you can also do something similar for things that you imported with animations that aren't geometry cache. You can, since I already dragged it to the scene, I can hit the track to try to add it. I'm going to select it. Now it's by default not going to really animate for anything because I've added it, but nothing's happening. So I'm going to jump to front, and I'm going to hit add, and then geometry cache, because this is what actually stores that animation. So now if I have it go, you can see it's kind of animating. Now again, I haven't finished the material, so it's going to look a little funny, and I don't know how the compression is going to see the kind of real time, since everything's just black, but it's moving. Now what you'll probably want to do is edit the range that this plays, which you can do that by dragging this red bar, which you can set those by setting this to a place. So I'm going to hold Control, scroll to zoom, and then I'm going to right click to pan, click at the top here to bring this to here, and then I'm going to hit this little bracket thing right here to set the red marker here, because that sets the ending, and then I can click the to front, and I'm just going to pan back over. I can also Control zoom out so I can see more, and now it can play the full animation. But one of the issues that's going to happen for mine is I had geometry nodes, which is one of the things I guess I forgot to mention earlier. When you try to import or export geometry nodes things, they don't necessarily work too well. For some reason here, it actually seemed to have done better. It actually has the text. Oh, that's because I imported one where I fixed it. That's right. Normally this text right here, which is being partially covered, would not be visible, because in my Blender scene, I actually have this text being made via a geometry node, which is not one of the settings you could properly export from Alembic, to my knowledge. So I normally have to delete this, just have it be solid text normally, and export it that way. Though it also messed up for me when it was text, so I normally had to then do a thing where I hit F3, typed convert, and then did convert to mesh, which I think you can also find under object. Yeah, and that converts it there. So with that, you now have this set up, if you add all the materials and everything, set those up, you can then have that. So essentially be wary of geometry nodes won't work. You'll probably have to find a workaround, which for me, I used it for a typing effect so that the letters just appeared over time. I edited that back in later. But to then render it, go to Window, Cinematics, Movie Render Queue, and this makes this little pop out, which you use to add the level sequence, which I'm going to add the one that I just made, and then render local is what you're probably going to want to do. Render remote is what you do if you're trying to render it somewhere else. It makes it a separate process, and you can set it to render at a different computer or somewhere. Excuse me. Local is what you're going to want if you're going to render it on your own computer. So here, I go to the settings, and by default, it tries to have it export as a JPEG using deferred rendering, and the output is where you see the resolution. The frame rate is normally 30 by default, though you can go through here and use custom frame rate to set the ones that you want, and the other things I normally leave because they don't do too much. I've never had to use the versioning because it just overwrites the existing output. If you want to, the output directory by default is actually going to be a folder. If you were to click on your project and hit show in folder, it would bring you to this, and it's under saved movie renders is where it normally sticks these frames. Now, you can change that output here by editing the output directory. You can also change how it names them, and I believe you can also edit some things related to the padding for how it puts the numbers on the frames that it renders. But if you wanted to change it from JPEG to PNG, you click here on settings and you click PNG sequence, and then you just undo that, so that way it only makes the PNG output. There's also different types of rendering, such as path tracer, but if you're going to do something like that, you probably could have stuck with cycles in Blender. So here I'm going to go with deferred rendering, so I'm using Lumen to actually try to get something that's closer to a Eevee render with global illumination. And then what you can do is, with all this done, you can then hit accept. You could also save this if you wanted to as a preset, which I've got one. If you want to add or look into more details on how to edit this, I found there is, I'll try to link this, a documentation page where they go over some of the settings of how you render frames in Unreal using the movie render queue. It goes over some different settings you can try to edit, such as adding anti-aliasing, as well as also editing a few settings to tell it to use specific types of ways that it does ray tracing, stuff like that. You can also edit the project settings, which I'll try to show here in a second, because I'm not going to hit render local because that would just make all of them. But to show the project settings off, I can go edit project settings, and one of the things, if you didn't enable ray tracing earlier, scroll down to rendering and you can see different things. You don't really have to mess with any of this in order to do the render, but if you didn't have ray tracing, you can click hardware ray tracing. This can make Lumen slightly faster or more reliable, but it should work by default with the settings in the Filmic if you used the version I told you that I used when I created it. So with that, that would allow you to create it and then export it. Is there anything I'm forgetting about? Oh yeah, if you do not use the correct frame rate or anything like that when you go and make it, you'll often end up with different weird artifacts as it interpolates in the geometry cache. For me, I had an issue where it started creating this, which I've also found is partially a bug with Unreal using Alembic files. It's probably just mine. I haven't seen other people complain about it, but if this happens to you, either your frame rate's off or like if it sits on this on a frame, your frame rate's probably off, because I've never had it happen after I fixed it. And I do still have some issues where if I go through and zoom in on this guy's face and I scrub to specific points, you'll probably see it. Yep, there we go. That's an issue where my faces are rotating in between the frames. If I sit on the frames, you never see it, but if you try to have it play quickly, it will have that error. Only happens mostly on his head for some reason. Can't really tell you why. I tried importing the Alembic into Blender, doesn't happen there, so it's a bug with Unreal. Hopefully it won't happen to you. But again, that should cover most of everything that I think is required. I did this. I talked about the scaling. I talked about geometry nodes, the frame rate, options on the importing. The other thing is you can set in this settings right here. You can go to engine scalability and change the settings currently being used by the lighting system. If you set it to cinematic, you will get the highest quality that Lumen offers without performing some console variable edits, which the link here earlier that I showed goes over. Cinematic gives you better shadows, because if I do something such as go and set the scalability to something like high, you'll notice that the shadows probably became grainier. If you go all the way to low, there's basically nothing shadow-wise. Medium has shadows, but doesn't look that great. High has more of that detailed shadowing and more reflection-like things, but they're a little blurry. Epic, better. For me, it's a little bit more grainy looking a little bit, because all these things are reflective by default. If you edit the materials, they should look better. And then cinematic has the highest quality that you can get, and I set it to that before I go and then have it render using the movie render queue to get a better output. And then of course, once you have the frames, you can do whatever you want with them. So I think that's just about everything. I'll try to add some edits here, going over anything that I missed if I did miss anything. Otherwise, hopefully this covers most of the problems that you might have, and if it did, hopefully your stuff is working out, because it took me hours to find some of the stuff scattered between different tutorials and documentation and tinkering, so hopefully I made it easier for somebody. Oh, one note that I did forget about that might appear, it's a little awkward that I'm adding in at the end, but if you do have some weird import issues, sometimes I found that the issue is that the object is weirdly scaled. I haven't had this issue this time, but I did have it when I messed with other times. Sometimes objects that have scaling that is not one, when imported, were scaled funny with some settings, which you can hit Control A to apply scale, and now all of its scale is set to 1. This will mess up objects that are actively parented to other things, since their scaling is then done locally. But if the object is just by itself in the scene, this is an easy edit. Hopefully it's not a problem, but if you did have that, that's how you would fix the objects being imported and they look funny. Even though everything else in your scene looks fine, it's probably that its scaling was off or not applied and Unreal read it weirdly. So something I did forget to mention earlier was how you would actually add the camera if you wanted to add that. So once you get the sequencer added, you can actually click this create new camera instead of the current camera cut. It automatically makes a cut for the camera by default, moving around, which I do by holding right click and then using WASD to position it. You can also position it using the other tools, but here you can hit this little arrow here to pop your camera out so you're not actually using the cinematic camera, which you can get back to that view by clicking the little camera next to it down here. And this camera by default, it's whatever camera you have in the sequencer, and the camera cut for it that determines how the animation or how it's actually recorded, and what camera it's doing and how. Which of course you can move it, you can actually add animations for how it moves and all that in here, and this has a lot more features you could probably mess with in the sequencer, but that would probably require going over a bunch of stuff with the sequencer, which you could probably watch a separate tutorial for.